Welfare history itself has diversified immensely to take into account a lot of voluntary work. So it's actually a very diverse field. What it has done less is to really try to fit in unpaid care work into these histories of institutional welfare development.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello and welcome to the Transformative Podcast with me, Rosamund Johnston. Today we're joined by Alexandra Ghiț, who was a colleague of ours here at RECET until she embarked upon a very prestigious Marie Skłodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the Leibniz Institute for the History and Culture of Eastern Europe in Leipzig, and whom we miss here in Vienna a lot. So today, Alexandra is going to be talking to us about her new book, Welfare Work Without Welfare, Women and Austerity in Interwar Bucharest, which came out late last year with De Gruyter Oldenburg. So Alex, first of all, congratulations on the still very new book, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Rosie, for the fantastic invitation. And I'm very glad to be able to do this. I should say the book is open access, besides everything. Thank you.
And definitely worth a read, I would add to that. So let's get straight to the key kind of concept in it, which I would argue is this theme of austerity welfare work. It's a term you raise in the introduction and you refer to throughout the book. I was wondering if you could explain to the listener what this term means and why it is of such importance here.
So austerity welfare work is a way of describing work that is focused on ensuring the well-being of others, especially in contexts where of the economic crisis or where the state is not very present. And I came up with this context, I think, with this concept, apologies, in dialogue with feminist theories of social reproduction and feminist historians who talk a lot about welfare work as the work of maintaining people generationally and on a daily basis. And that can entail what we normally or more often refer to as care work for the well-being of children, of dependents, but also a fair amount of housework, usually for families. However, we have to think that institutions increasingly intervene in one way or another in organizing social reproduction and welfare. So I wanted to have a concept that captures how institutions and welfare actors that are sent by the state or the private sector on behalf of the state, how they intervene in welfare and keep them within the same concept. And at the same time, we know increasingly that care work can be commodified, and we need only think of the thousands of sort of Pflegerinnen and Betreuerinnen that come through Austria to this end, if nothing else. But historically, it has been, for example, domestic servants who have done immense amounts of care work within families and therefore ensured social reproduction work. I wanted to think of welfare work across this continuum of privatized household work on behalf of families for dependents, done without pay, paid work within households, done again for the well-being of families under various circumstances, but also the increasing presence of the state or charitable institutions who claim to improve welfare work or redirect welfare work or assist in one way or another in arranging social reproduction. It is austere welfare work, again, because this is done in periods especially of economic crisis. And social reproduction theorists talk a lot about how women step in to make up for welfare state retrenchment, especially in the post-World War II period. But for me, it was sort of quite important to think, well, how did this work when you didn't yet have a full-on welfare state, or the welfare state that was being built was highly exclusionary. So austerity welfare work. I should point out, and I really want to make clear that I think historians specifically have a very nice way of devising concepts that help interpretation rather than theory building for itself. And I think I could have made the concept smoother and less open and worked on it, but I genuinely wanted to have a theoretically inflected social history of welfare provision in Interwar Bucharest, rather than sort of have a theorization of austerity welfare work, and where sort of the case of Interwar Bucharest is kind of a just a case study that supports the theorizing. And I think this has its advantages. I can go on about the choice, but this is why I wanted to keep it as a relatively open-ended concept, hopefully one that will be of use to other historians, but that fundamentally illuminates or is indebted to the sources that I have seen.
To stick with this term a little bit longer, you point out in the introduction that histories of work and histories of welfare are very often kind of different literatures. They're not often told together. And then, you've really kind of made a hybrid of them in the very title of your book. We're talking about welfare work here. So why do you think that these two histories have so often been told separately? And then what do we get when we bring these two worlds together, or these two literatures together?
Yeah, so I think the simple answer, you could say, well, it's male bias in historiography, and that we tend to tell both histories of welfare, or until a certain point, and histories of work with men's experiences and men's life courses in mind. So histories of welfare have tended for quite a long time, or at least initially, to focus on the development of social insurance schemes, for instance, whereas histories of labor have tended to focus on the experiences of usually skilled male workers in standard employment, which were even among men rather the exception than the rule. I should say that welfare history itself, I think in the past 40 years, has diversified immensely to take into account a lot of voluntary work in charitable associations and religious organizations. So it's actually a very diverse field. What it has done perhaps less or not as often is to really try to fit in unpaid care work into these histories of institutional welfare developments along what is more usually defined as a private-public continuum. And I think what I wanted to do in line with these more recent feminist theorizing, but also most recent historiographies, is to really fully incorporate women's paid and unpaid work within households within these histories of welfare. And conversely, for histories of work and histories of labor, I think especially new global labor history now is fully listening to the call of feminists of several decades to say you fully must integrate unpaid work and account for how care work changes work experiences in the histories of labor that we write, especially on global level, and to fully account, for example, for coerced labor or for forms of semi-coerced labor or informalized labor. And that we see a lot with gendered work or with arrangements such as domestic service that can exist on a continuum of so-called free labor to highly coerced form of service. I claim in the book that histories of work are histories of welfare and histories of welfare are histories of work, exactly in order to try to keep together attention to both institutional and legal developments in terms of social policy, but to always point out that they are tied to certain gendered divisions of labor and certain societal ways of organizing social reproduction, and that if you center this, you have very different histories of state building, for example, welfare state development, or really labor.
Now, if we were to stick with this and kind of follow this argument that I think you really convincingly make, that welfare, its execution, its administration, its use is innately gendered, can we talk about that a little bit more, about the ways in which you find this welfare in particular to be gendered, and then whether you notice any change over time? Is this a story of the patriarchy at the beginning and the end of this period, really bluntly put?
Welfare is gendered, as I mentioned, because welfare programs since the late 19th century are really quite geared towards male industrial workers or civil servants, and geared towards men's employment situations. So women are, even when they are paid workers, are often only partly included in some certain social protection arrangements initially. And when they are housewives, they are often not co-insured, which, for example, remains the case for Interwar Bucharest quite late into the 30s. And I think, as you well remarked, it is important to say, by the interwar, there's a lot of social policy change and initiative in Europe, for example, driven by the International Labour Organization, that increasingly tries to expand certain forms of insurance or to devise new specific forms of welfare that reach women. And you have, we have great innovation in Red Vienna. There's quite some innovation in England at the time through efforts by Labour governments, especially. But not only, and at the same time you have the rise of very authoritarian ideas and about exclusionary forms of welfare provision as well. So there's a certain amount of change, and there's at the same time a countervailing tendency of not going ahead with these grand plans, of not spending as much as you should. And that is what I find in interwar Romania too, that in fact welfare remains very highly gendered because it's not getting expanded to these new categories of beneficiaries. War widows should have benefited from more. Women should have been co-insured. Domestic servants, overwhelmingly, so around 19% in urban areas, women should have been insured, and they only get insured in the late 30s rather than sort of the late 1920s or the early 1920s, as is the case. So welfare remains gendered, even though there is technically a move towards incorporating more women into social insurance arrangements. In a second sense, it is gendered because women do most of the childcare and household duties, even when they start doing a lot more paid work, which is the case after the First World War. And in a third sense, it is gendered because it is a field of governance or policy making that has been influenced and shaped by women experts, whether certified or sort of self-styled women experts, to a far greater extent than any other field, perhaps with the certain parts of medicine, right? So by the interwar, this expertise is increasingly powerful and increasingly transnationalized. And this too is one way, I think, the fact that you have this expansion of social policy and assistance policy towards women is to no small extent due to the fact that you have a few more women able to exert power in municipal and even transnational governance about this. But let's be clear, this is still very small numbers, but still.
So you mentioned there that this is an increasingly sort of transnationalized set of questions or expertise as the interwar period moves on. Your study remains really kind of thoughtfully and meaningfully anchored in the city of Bucharest, right? So I guess I wanted to ask you the extent to which you think, telling a very locally bounded story of austerity welfare work in Bucharest, and the extent to which actually what you are capturing is kind of continental-wide or even more global kind of changes in the way that welfare is thought of and administered over this period.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you have seen this in the book, because that was one of my key preoccupations. So I do want to tell a transnational story. At the same time, for me, it was fully important to sort of execute in a way this transnational turn in a way that fully allows local dynamics, local actors, local path dependencies and traditions of welfare, for example, to fully shine through, and to show, for example, local improvisation and local resistance to transnationalized dynamics and the extent to which there was pushback. And I think I wanted to do this because it was very important for me to tell a story in which Bucharest is not simply like a landing place for transnational actors who arrive and they bring ideas and so on, but rather really a policy environment of its own and an economy of its own, and a place where people arrive, especially from the countryside, with very particular ideas. So there's significant transnational mobility at the time. At the same time, I was very keen to be able to reconstruct the local dynamics and allow them to shine through. But I hope, as is also clear, there are many entanglements Europe-wide. But, for example, I found the literature on welfare development and welfare policies in Latin American context to be extremely illuminating and presenting many more similarities than I would have expected with a periphery, semi-periphery such as Bucharest. So there's excellent work on Argentina and Chile that I found very, very important and very good. And I think that belongs in the same picture and the same global dynamic.
And if we were to zoom in even further, you really focus on the kind of profession of the household servant as someone, as a group, a class of people having to kind of resolve many of the tensions that you look at in your book. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about why and how household servants become these kind of key actors in austerity welfare work?
So household servants, especially in Bucharest, are migrants from the countryside. There is a major rural debt crisis, especially by 1929, and it's a long context why. And it's very clear that it becomes possible and important for many young women who otherwise would have stayed on the land to come to Bucharest and try to make a living as domestic workers. Domestic service at the time is still ruled by a servants' code rather than by employment contracts, and this is a very particular and disadvantaging set of sort of rules when it comes to your relationship to the employer. So they often live in the employer's house. Their pay might be once a year or monthly. They may or may not have time off, and they are largely unseen by labor inspectors, for instance. So they do a lot of care work in urban environments in order to send remittances, for example, at home, or at least to unburden the households of their parents. So domestic service is a profession for especially unmarried young women, or for very young girls, I should say. So the age can be really 9 years and up that you start doing household work in as a servant. And secondly, there are many women's and feminist organizations at the time who begin to recognize that household service, domestic service, is very important for the way in which households manage, especially during times of economic hardship. So a good lady of the house can, of course, administer a good budget, but a good servant is also crucial to this. So who you employ is very important. And domestic service can alleviate a crisis of unemployment for among women who are more highly educated than the job usually requires. So there are several organizations who try to convince or persuade high school educated, even students, so university educated women, to consider what is otherwise a rather disreputable or questionable or not well regarded profession of domestic service as a solution for them. Conversely, these organizations who do all sorts of other welfare activities become allies of the state in pushing back young women towards the countryside when they think that they are migrating to Bucharest without great prospects for employment. And so they kind of buy them train tickets in order to send them back. So this is a kind of a complex interaction between state or state-backed welfare providers and these women who do austerity welfare work as servants under quite different circumstances. So they're very different austerity welfare workers. I do nevertheless believe they play their own parts in managing what was the Great Depression, especially, and its aftermath in Bucharest with different ways and in different ways and with different tools. Yeah.
A last question is that you use some of the sources that are generated very often by women social workers, this kind of first wave of social workers who are institutionalized during this period, to try and kind of get at the sensibilities and the life worlds of some welfare users. And this makes very, very good sense because we don't have a ton of sources and memoirs of 9-year-old servants or other somewhat kind of disenfranchised constituencies. But I wondered the extent to which you found it possible, right, to reconstruct some of the stories and the sensibilities of these, I suppose, more marginalized welfare users using these kind of official top-down sources, the extent to which, what they can tell us and then what they can't.
So I would have wanted to have many more such sources, and I should say, despite years of searching, Bucharest has relatively fragile archives of social reform compared to, for example, there's research on Paris that has tens of thousands of casework files. And for Bucharest, we simply don't have that. And I do believe I've searched quite thoroughly. We have one complete case file. I could identify several welfare questionnaires, several petitions, 5-6 lines long. And then oral history interviews, and what was quite wonderful for me, the sort of transcribed songs and poems by a young woman who had been a domestic servant in late 1930s Bucharest. We have few of these sources that capture in their own words what so-called welfare beneficiaries, or really welfare workers of a certain kind, wanted to get from the state in order to alleviate their own sort of social reproduction burden, let's say. And yeah, it's important to point out that these, especially casework files, but petition too, they are ways of, they intend to persuade in certain ways, and they intend to make use of existing categories and existing rhetorics in order to gain what is to be gained out of the interaction with authorities in general. So even though social workers are trained to be relatively empathetic, or at least extremely attentive to what they are seeing, they themselves are operating, especially from the mid-1930s on, in increasingly conservative ideological environments where women's right to work is questioned. So there's a rhetoric of disorganization of families because of women's paid employment, and we find this in quite a lot of research. Social workers will spend maybe more time than the beneficiaries, let's say, themselves would have spent on describing medical situations or ailments or illnesses. And for me, it was important to not make as much as people in the interwar did about infectious disease. Maybe I don't go in a lot of detail explaining the choice. So I do mention when people suffer from syphilis or tuberculosis, but I wouldn't say I downplay it. I simply do not make it as central as some would have made it at the time. And yes, they contain what historian of welfare Karen Theis has called tales of protection or tales of detection. These tales are meant to protect some and detect the fraud of others. And the detection of fraud is a central concern in austerity welfare provision in Bucharest. So there is a lot of this questioning what people say and double checking. And so I tried a little bit to read against the grain of the intentions of these social actors. And how I did this was not simply by applying different assumptions, but rather by fully understanding the knowledge production context in which they operated at the time. So there is quite a lot about expertise and knowledge production in the book, because I don't think you can divorce this discussion from any sort of social history in the context where you have quite a few, very few sources that speak otherwise, so that are not produced by such actors. So about, I would say, half of the book or a third of the book is in many ways a story about knowledge production.
Alexandra Ghiț, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for listening. Join us next time for another episode of the Transformative Podcast.